Have you ever wondered how expensive new drugs gain access to local markets? It's not just about clinical trials and the results they produce. Behind the scenes, strategic agreements play a crucial role in making innovative, high-cost drugs available to patients. These deals, also known as managed entry agreements, have a huge influence on drug availability and pricing. That's why in today's video we're going to explore the objectives of these agreements, differentiate between three types of managed entry agreements, and examine the specific risk mitigation mechanisms in detail. Before we dive in, let's take a moment to clarify what managed entry agreements actually are. Managed entry agreements are contracts between manufacturers and payers designed to address the high costs or uncertainties about the clinical effectiveness of expensive new drug therapies. The underlying idea of these agreements is to shift post-approval uncertainties from the payers to the manufacturers. Without such agreements, all the risks associated with introducing the new technology would lie with the payer. Is the drug really as effective in the real world as it promised to be in the clinical studies? What's the drug's utilization pattern? How may this affect budget impact and overall costs? Managed entry agreements help mitigate these concerns payers might have when considering allocating funds for the new intervention. Let's break down the different types of managed entry agreements. As you can see, we can distinguish three types of agreements: finance-based agreements, performance-based agreements, and service-based agreements. When we look at the rationale behind each of these agreement types, we see that finance-based agreements focus on controlling the total commitment of expenditure the payer has to shoulder, whereas performance-based agreements link drug payments to outcome-specific conditions, reducing financial risk for payers if the drug does not perform as expected. Service-based agreements, on the other hand, aim to enhance optimal use and outcomes of a new treatment, and thereby reducing uncertainties related to the drug's effectiveness and utilization. Two of the three agreement types can be implemented on different levels, either targeting patients directly or setting out conditions that affect the entire patient population. Depending on the level of implementation, managed entry agreements can be broken down further based on the mechanisms they use to achieve the desired outcomes. You can see that there are a bunch of different mechanisms in place that drug companies and payers can use to attenuate post-approval uncertainties and risk. Let me walk you through them one at a time, starting with finance-based managed entry agreements. You can also use the timestamps in the video description in case you are only here for one particular mechanism. First on the list of finance-based mechanisms are so-called price-volume agreements. These agreements tie the price of a new drug to the volume of its usage. Essentially, the agreement establishes a tiered pricing structure, where the price per unit decreases as the volume of the drug sold increases, often to ensure that the total expenditure remains within a pre-agreed budget. That's why you get step pricing curves like this one, where certain price drops are built in whenever predefined volume thresholds are reached. Another finance-based entry mechanism is to agree on a budget cap that limits the total expenditure that payers will allocate for a specific drug over a defined period. Once the expenditure reaches the cap, further payments may be reduced, suspended, or adjusted, often through discounts or rebates. This mechanism helps control costs by providing a safeguard against unexpectedly high spending on high-priced medications, while still allowing access to the new drug. This graph shows a simplified example where the budget cap is set to 4 million, and any costs that exceed the threshold are not covered by the payer. A very popular form of managed entry agreements are simple discounts, which have to be the most widely used mechanism out there of all the ones that we're covering today. Simple discounts use a pricing strategy where the price of a drug is reduced by a fixed percentage or amount. This discount is applied directly to the original price, lowering the cost the buyer has to pay. For example, a drug manufacturer may give a 15% discount on the list price upfront, which results in a discounted net price of £3,400. Given that most drugs will have a simple discount applied to them, these discounts are the reason most list prices of drugs are actually meaningless. Discounted net prices are typically not publicly available, and hence the public perception of what a drug costs are driven by the visibility of the list prices. The problem is that this perception is hugely biased, as list prices are not the price insurance companies actually pay most of the times. The next mechanism could very well be moved to performance-based agreements, but the publication which I used as a reference for this video labeled them as finance-based agreements. Here I'm talking about a contract that ties payments for the new drug to a condition that patients are enrolled in a clinical trial. Only if this condition is met will the drug manufacturer receive reimbursement for the new drug. After a period of time, this reimbursement condition may well be revised when the clinical trial report results. Should these results validate the initial clinical outcomes, reimbursement restrictions may be lifted and full payments can be made to the pharma company for the entire patient population. Next on our list of finance-based agreements, we've got rebates. Rebates are like discounts with a tiny little twist. The twist is that, as opposed to simple discounts, rebates are applied post-purchase. So if a pharma company sets their price to $4,000, let's say, the insurance company would pay $4,000 initially and then get a rebate of $600 later from the pharma company if a certain condition is met. You can see that the actual amount paid by the insurance company after the rebate is the same as if they had agreed on a simple 15% discount, but rather than applying the discount upfront at the time of purchase, the insurance company has to claim a proportion of the price back later on. Before we move on to performance-based agreements, the last financial mechanism I'd like to cover are fund-based payments. Such fund-based payments are comparable to budget caps, but they allow more flexibility in contrast to the more rigid budget caps. In a fund-based payment model, a fixed amount of money is allocated upfront to cover a set of services or treatments. Healthcare providers or pharmaceutical companies are then paid from this fund as services are rendered or drugs are supplied. The amount of money allocated to a fund is thereby often established based on estimated needs, but it may offer more flexibility for how that money is used. For example, imagine a hospital treating cancer patients, and the hospital manager is negotiating with a payer to cover the cost of chemotherapy, surgery, and follow-up care. A fund-based payment approach for this may establish a fund of $10 million to cover all oncology services for the year. Alternatively, the hospital may agree on a hard budget cap, whereby they get paid up to $50,000 per patient and nothing more. If the costs for patients exceed that cap, the hospital faces significant risks, potentially forcing the hospital to reduce treatment or delay care once the cap is actually reached. A fund-based payment, on the other hand, offers more flexibility, as the hospital can move resources around from other patients, which they could treat at a lower cost. Now, let's shift our focus to the performance-based agreements. First on this list is the performance guarantee, which is often referred to as pay for performance. In this case, the payment for the new drug to a pharma company is contingent on the achievement of a pre-specified response to treatment in each patient. Payers may withhold payment partially or entirely for each patient until the desired outcome is actually achieved, and they may receive full or partial refunds for the patients who do not achieve a response. Very similar to performance guarantees, conditional treatment continuation, or CTC, is a performance-based scheme where the payer continues to cover the cost of the drug or medical device based on short-term treatment goals to ensure that only patients that benefit from the treatment will remain on treatment coverage. Initially, pharma companies may offer the drug at a discounted price or even free of charge. The last mechanism in the performance-based managed entry agreement category includes coverage with evidence development. As the name suggests, these agreements require that the drug manufacturer collects additional data, for example, in a clinical trial that informs the use of the medical product in the payer population. Based on the outcomes of this study, the payer then may maintain, withdraw, or extend coverage of the new intervention or make price adjustments. The third type of managed entry agreements are so-called service-based agreements, which can be designed in 6 different ways. For starters, let's have a look at patient support programs. According to the guideline Good Pharmacovigilance Practices, a patient support program is an organized system where a marketing authorization holder receives and collects information relating to the use of its medicinal products. Examples are post-authorization patient support and disease management programs, surveys of patients and healthcare professionals, information gathering on patient compliance, or compensation and reimbursement schemes. The goal of these programs is to support patients so that they can optimally use the new intervention and therefore improve their treatment outcomes. Another component of service-based agreements may focus on infrastructure improvements. For instance, a company may contribute to the cost of upgrading hospital infrastructure in exchange for ensuring the availability of their new drug or therapy in certain hospitals. This approach helps both improve healthcare facilities while ensuring the appropriate resources are in place to support new medical innovations. That's why infrastructure improvements programs can be part of managed entry agreements, aiming to improve the effective use of a pharma company's drug. Payers may also value the chance to pay for new drugs in small, separate installments, rather than having to make one single big payment. That's why payer cash flow considerations can be part of service-based managed entry agreements, as they reduce upfront financial burden and offer an improved cost distribution, even if total costs for the payer stay the same. Moving on to our next service-based mechanism, adherence initiatives are a great way to improve patient outcomes and thereby reduce payer costs. Pharma companies can support adherence initiatives in multiple ways, for example by sending out reminders to patients to take their medication, providing monetary incentives, facilitate patient education, or automatically renew drug prescriptions. As adherence should drive improved patient outcomes, these improvements will eventually result in cost savings for payers. Apart from adherence initiatives, pharma companies may also partner with payers to collect and analyze data. For example, such partnerships may focus on the development of data sharing platforms, which facilitates the analysis of oncology patients via electronic health records. Alternatively, pharma companies may partner up with payers to design predictive analytical models with the goal of identifying high-risk patients or optimizing treatment pathways. Last, pharma companies could decide to fund healthcare professionals to set up patient education workshops. As we've seen earlier, these educational efforts can be integrated in broader initiatives which combine multiple components, for example, with the overarching goal to tackle patient adherence and improve outcomes. If we zoom out for a moment, you can see that pharma companies have a plethora of tools to choose from in order to gain access for high-priced drugs to local markets. Before drug companies make use of these managed entry agreements, though, they usually have to prove that they're cost-effective against the standard of care. To do that, they will plot their ICEs on a cost-effectiveness plane against a willingness to pay threshold. If you're curious to learn more about the basics of cost-effectiveness planes, willingness to pay thresholds, and cost-effectiveness frontiers, then I highly recommend that you check out my video on the topic, which you can see on screen right now.